Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a chemistry demonstration to share with you today. We're using this book by Roberto Trosli called Chemistry the Waldorf Way. This is for grades 7 and 8, and today we're going to be working on the demonstrations related to combustion. So the first demonstrations are ones where you're going to be observing the difference between chemical and physical changes. What I like about the way this book is set up is that you can see that the equipment and materials are listed on this side, which means that as you go through the book, you can quickly find the equipment and materials that you'll need for your demonstration so that you can plan ahead. The other thing that's nice about the way this book is laid out is that you can see a week at a glance here with the trajectory of all of the demonstrations and what you're trying to achieve with each of them. The only difference is that while these demonstrations are shown for day 1, these are ones that I would do each on one day rather than all at once. And as a homeschooler, I have that kind of flexibility. If you were doing this in a classroom, you can see that all of these are suggested for day 1, but at least you can see the whole arc of where you're going with the first week with the demonstrations for this part of the main lesson block, as it is divided up into 3 different blocks with combustion coming first. So for this first part, we're going to do the demonstration without any explanation as to what we are doing. That part is saved for the following day when we do the review and then eventually work in the main lesson book where we write up the demonstration with what happened. We include an illustration, and in some cases we will do it as a lab report, but in other cases we're doing it similar to our previous main lesson write-ups where there will be an illustration and a narration. Now for these particular illustrations and narrations, it is important to be as accurate as you can be because that is part of the scientific method. We want to be very specific if we're doing anything with weight or time or materials. We want to be accurate with those. And when it comes to the illustrations, while I have used other illustrations that are a little bit easier to illustrate rather than our actual apparatus, I do think it is better to actually illustrate the apparatus as part of the write-up for the chemistry main lesson book. We're going to start with the chemical changes, but there is another video that has all of the demonstrations we did for physical changes, and I encourage you to check the description box below for the link to that video. We're going to start out with chemical changes with baking soda and vinegar. This is a classic demonstration that's often done with geology, but it's actually a chemistry demonstration. We're going to measure out our baking soda and our vinegar because I'm hoping that when we're adding them together, we can see a change in our weight. It actually doesn't happen. However, it's still a lot of fun to see this chemical change and see the gas that's produced. And yes, I didn't intend for it to go all over the place, but it did anyway. It got on the scale and everything. And that's a lot of good fun because you really can see the production of gas. But I really want to see if we could measure both the liquid and the solid and see if we could have a reduction since there is so much gas that's produced during this chemical change. However, our scale isn't sensitive enough to measure those changes, and so we did end up with a conservation of mass when we did this project. However, we can still see a production of gas when we mix both this solid and this liquid together. And you can see that when you mix vinegar with another salt, specifically NaCl, you can see that it does not have any reaction. We're now moving on to another chemical demonstration by burning paper. This is homemade paper that we made for our physical changes demonstration. Now we're going to use combustion in order to transform this paper. Now the paper does transform into a gas and you have a solid that's left behind, and when you take the mass of that solid that's left behind, it's negligible. Our scale is not sensitive enough to show how much is left, but we can definitely see that most of it has turned into both a gas and vapor. It's time to do the write-up for our demonstration. I'm using some Lyra color pencils and a main lesson book that measures 9.5 inches by 12 inches. We're going to include both an illustration as well as a narration for this demonstration. We are not doing a typical lab write-up for this demonstration. I'm going to be doing this on basically a 3-page spread. We're going to have one side of our entry be our chemical changes. We're going to be using the onion skin that separates the paper. It's not intended to be used, but we find that we're using it quite a bit with our main lessons, especially in anatomy and chemistry. And then we're going to do our physical changes on the adjoining page, on the next page. So I have a candle on one side as well as a flask on the other side, and this is to show the two chemical changes that we did for this demonstration, both the burning of paper as well as the chemical change that occurred when we mixed vinegar with baking soda. I am doing a candle that's different than the match that we use. This is just for aesthetic reasons. We have used this same illustration often in our chemistry main lesson book. However, I do think that it's better to do an illustration that is of the apparatus that you actually used for your demonstration. I'm adding a few details here to show the wax is sort of melting off the side, which is part of the physical change. So it's kind of nice to add that little bit of information into this illustration that sort of looks towards part of the other demonstration that we did. And of course, we're going to have the chemical change of paper being burnt, but the paper that I show burning isn't going to be illustrated until the very end of this entry. Next, I'm going to add a flask with both baking soda as well as vinegar. And it's a little bit harder to illustrate baking soda and vinegar versus one of the other reactions that we did for our chalk drawing, where we can use other chemicals that are more colorful. I think it's just fun to do those, but we're trying to be accurate in depicting the actual demonstration that we did. So adding grays and blacks and whites to a page that's already white was a little bit challenging, but we labeled it up and that way we can see what that chemical change was. It's now time to write up the lab report in a narrative format. We're not doing a typical lab report with procedures and materials, but we are writing our reflections and what is happening during the chemical change. This helps collect our thoughts, and while this is an example of what student work would look like, this is the example that I'm doing in a main lesson book rather than on a chalkboard, which would typically be what we would expect in a classroom setting or even in a homeschool setting, that this illustration might be depicted on a chalkboard with other notes included that the student could copy into their main lesson book. Once this written narration is complete, my daughter is welcome to review this in preparation of writing her own narration, and the illustrations are ones that she can copy too. So I tend to do this about a day in advance so that when she's ready to write up her lesson, she has an illustration to copy. You can certainly do this on a chalkboard. I just like having it in a main lesson book as it allows me to keep our lessons flowing progressively without having something that needs to be erased on the chalkboard in order to write up a new illustration. And sometimes that happens when we might be ahead of our demonstrations and we haven't done our write-up. I'm writing the little bit of paper on the side there, partly because I had tried to do a little caption there that didn't look so great, and really I needed a little bit of paper burning to really show this chemical change. I'm also adding a few other details to the other side of the page, which is our onion skin. And I wanted to add the triangle of combustion, which includes oxygen, fuel, and heat. And this is something that we previously had on our chalkboard. I'm including it here in this 2-page spread to really depict what is going on with combustion. We've done a number of combustion demonstrations. This is a nice way to bring all of those demonstrations together in chemical and physical changes. Here's a final look at our main lesson book entry for chemical changes, which includes the illustration as well as the narration. I'm really glad that we ended up using that onion skin as well. I think it's a really nice way to close out this section before moving on. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our chemistry demonstration and main lesson book entry. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information as well as other tutorials for our chemistry main lesson block. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.